Hey everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Professor Dershowitz, it's great to see you again, and almost happy birthday.
And happy birthday to you, Yom Haletet Sameach. It was my bar mitzvah sedra this past week, and it was Parshat Shoftim, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof, justice, justice, must you pursue. So 6 years ago, I was already talking about justice.
Yeah, little did they know the career that you would one day have, right? It's amazing.
My rabbi's very surprised.
Absolutely. All right, well, on that note, let's start talking about some serious issues. Our first guest today is Ambassador Ron Prosor, a distinguished Israeli diplomat who has served as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, the United Kingdom, and the Director General of the Foreign Ministry. Today, he is the head of the Abba Eban Institute of International Diplomacy at the IDC Herzliya. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so as we all know, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has recently made his first visit to Israel and the Palestinian territories. Secretary Guterres has reiterated his commitment to a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians, but many are questioning whether his visit will truly have any impact on the current state of affairs. Now, Ambassador, can you give us, both Professor Dershowitz and myself and our viewers, a take on what his visit means for the state of affairs in this region?
Well, first and foremost, the fact is that he's a new Secretary General, and before he even goes to his first General Assembly, where he presides over, in September, he comes over to the Middle East. So A, he's interested. B, it's important enough on the world agenda for him to really see with his own eyes what's happening. It's not the first time he's here. He was the Prime Minister of Portugal. And I think what we saw, and I met him today, is basically someone who's ready to do something. And we have enough words. I mean, there's an institutional structural bias against Israel at the UN, which we don't have time to even go into. But if he really wants to do something operational, here's something. Secretary General, if you want to prevent the third Lebanon war, make sure UNIFIL begins to do what it has to do. And up in the north, because if just like Ambassador Haley said, if the commander of the UNIFIL forces says he doesn't know of any Hezbollah violations or weapons in the region, well, my God, wake up. You're not. But what should one do? One should really make sure that UNIFIL, really does what its mandate allows it to do. And why is it important? Because no one in Israel or in the States or anywhere else really thinks that we want UNIFIL to fight Hezbollah. We know what the force is, and we don't want them to fight Hezbollah. But what we want them to use some of the toolbox that they have. Mm-hmm. What are the tools? For example, drones. They can use drones going up into the air, showing violations of Hezbollah. This would be transmitted to New York and would create a situation with Security Council members, Europeans, the French, the Brits, who usually make a differentiation between the military and the political arm, won't have a choice but to really point fingers at Hezbollah. Today, as we speak, UNIFIL says everything is fine, nothing. So it's like those three monkeys. We don't see anything, we don't hear anything, we don't say anything. This has to change. He can change that.
Yeah, Professor Dershowitz, what is your response to what he's saying about UNIFIL?
Well, first of all, Israel and the world were so fortunate to have Ron Prosor as Israel's permanent representative to the United Nations. He filled that role with such incredible distinction. As you can see from his comments, he's both brilliant and charming. He knows how to fight when fighting is necessary, and he knows how to make friends when making friends is necessary. He was a legendary UN ambassador, and I'm glad he fills the seat that Abba Eban once filled, because he does it with a distinction similar to that performed by the great Abba Eban. When I was growing up, 10 years old, I sat in front of the television with my father, watching Abba Eban talk when the United Nations divided Palestine mandatory Palestine into a nation state for the Jewish people, a nation state for the Arab people, something the Arab nations to this day don't accept, and the Palestinian Authority still doesn't accept, that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. And I think that Ron speaks wisdom about UNIFIL. I think the United Nations not only hasn't done anything, it's been part of the problem in Lebanon, it's been part of the problem in Gaza, and it's about time that the United Nations fulfills its obligation as a peacekeeping organization rather than a war facilitating organization. The UN facilitated the 67 war by pulling out of where it was supposed to be, and it created problems in Gaza and in Lebanon. So I hope that the new Secretary General, who I'm told is a terrific person, not only does he have a great mind, but a great neshama, a good soul.
Sure.
I hope he will take much more seriously the peacekeeping role of the United Nations and try to help prevent further warfare rather than serve as a facilitator to further warfare.
Well, here's my question.
My goal is someday hoping that Ron Persar will be the Secretary General of the United Nations, and what a role he would perform. But tragically, Israel has never been allowed to engage in any leadership role. Hopefully in the next several years it may serve on the Security Council for the first time. But the United Nations, under its new Secretary General, must become more objective, more neutral, and must fulfill its role as peacekeeper. And I'm more encouraged than I've ever been with the new Secretary General.
Well, here's my question for you. I mean, how much of an impact does he truly have on the state of affairs within the United Nations? Because, you know, the Secretary General of the United Nations is not necessarily like the Prime Minister of Israel or the President of the United States. What do you think he's really going to be able to do when it comes to actually changing what is taking place with UNIFIL on the ground, or UNRWA, or even UNESCO?
Well, I want to lead to answer that exactly, on the background of what Professor Dershowitz just said, and that is, you can make a difference, Secretary General. You nominate people. You can nominate Israelis to the rank of assistant secretaries, undersecretaries. You had no one at the UN since the establishment of the State of Israel. You have Yemenites and Lebanese and Bahrainis and Jordanians and Egyptians. No one from Israel. So you really want to create change? Put Israelis there. You're really impressed from Israeli know-how, innovation, what Sivan is doing basically in Africa? Put Israelis into the UN. We want to make a difference. For us, it's tikkun olam. Can he do it? Back to your question. Absolutely. He's the Secretary General. He has the steering wheel. Can he decide for? No, he can't decide for 193 countries, but he has the executive powers to make a difference. And like Alan said, I think he's there to make a difference. And he spoke at Beit HaTfutzot and basically said how sorry he was that his own country, Portugal, basically threw out the Jews out of Portugal. And he said, I'm sorry, we shouldn't have done that. I want Secretary General Guterres not to say sorry in 20 years, but to help make the nation state of the Jewish people today, Israel, a place where the structural bias and the institutional bias is going to change under his helmet.
Now, Professor Dershowitz, there was a comment from the Secretary Guterres who essentially said that the Israeli Prime Minister in Israel should stop taking so seriously the criticism that are coming from the United Nations. Is that a fair statement to make? Why does it...
Well, it's an insult to the United Nations, and maybe the United Nations deserves to be insulted. But the way I understood his statement is, don't take seriously what the United Nations says when it attacks Israel. It's not that serious an organization. And he's right. The General Assembly, was it Abba Eban who said that if Algeria introduced a resolution that the earth is flat and that Israel flattened it, it would win, 110 to 63 with 21 abstentions? When you have a resolution like the Security Council resolution recently that declares the Jewish Quarter of Jerusalem, the Kotel, the access roads to Hebrew University and Hadassah Hospital to be illegally occupied territory, a position apparently supported by President Barack Obama, you don't take them seriously. That's ahistorical, it's faulty, it's wrong. So I hope that at some point maybe we'll be able to take the General Assembly seriously, we'll be able to take the United Nations seriously. I remember being in a debate once and saying that Israelis never get nominated to positions. And my opponent says, but Professor Falk of Princeton was appointed to be a rapporteur on Israel and Palestine, and he's Jewish. Of course, Professor Falk doesn't believe that Israel has the right to exist. He's a virulent anti-Zionist, and he's the Jew who's appointed to give cover, much like Goldstone was appointed to the commission to give cover to a report which was filled with lies. So the UN knows how to use Jews to give cover, but it has never known how to use Israelis and people who really believe in trying to resolve this issue in a positive and progressive way. So I hope that someday soon we'll be able to take the UN seriously. But right now I agree with the Secretary General that many of the pronouncements by the United Nations and by its organizations against Israel should not be taken seriously.
Speaking of that, what about the Human Rights Commission? We didn't even mention the Human Rights Commission in the United Nations, which constantly singles out Israel. Can we expect any changes on that front?
Well, the Council on Human Rights is like having Charles Manson run the crime investigation squad of the NYPD. I mean, Libya and others chairing this. I mean, this is what can I tell you? It's unbelievable. It's basically like, you had that program, Ripley's Believe It or Not. This is unbelievable. It's unbelievable to know that the Saudis are chairing the conference on the status of women. I can't invent this. Or the Iranians, were the deputy chair of the Commission on Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. It's unbelievable. The minute I tell you the stories, you say, my God. So the answer, Council on Human Rights, God, this is the Council on abuse of rights and singling out Israel all the time and having an agenda item, which Professor Dershowitz knows very well and articulated so brilliantly. You have an Article 4 that basically deals with human rights violations all over the world, and a specific Article 7 that singles only one country in the world, and that's Israel. Mm-hmm. And what is amazing is that some of the European countries abstain in that vote. So who supports us? The United States of America, Canada, Israel, and the great empire of Palau. The others abstain. So say, God, I went to the British ambassador. The British ambassadors always have a sir before their name. Mm-hmm. Said, hey, Mark, Sir Mark Lyle Grant, am I not good enough at least to be with a crowd with North Korea, Libya, and Syria? I can up my game. Why are you singling me out? And there's no real answer to that. So this is exactly the bias which makes it ridiculous. It's ridiculous to say, like Alan said, that Jews don't have a connection to Jerusalem or the Temple Mount. It's ridiculous. And here, you can really cut a line. Guterres is smart enough to know the history, and I think he can make a change.
Professor Dershowitz, give us a quick response to this, because we have more that we want to cover.
The United States seriously considered getting out of that council and ultimately decided not to. René Cassin, who was a great French Jew, won the Nobel Prize for the Declaration of Human Rights and other commitments to human rights. He'd be turning over in his grave today when he understood how human rights have been turned against Israel and become human wrongs. I'll never forget when I went to Switzerland because Ahmadinejad was invited to be the keynote speaker at the Human Rights Council talking about human rights. And we staged a walkout there, and I ended up getting arrested because I wanted to challenge Ahmadinejad. I asked him an embarrassing question. I asked him to debate the Holocaust with me and to debate it at Auschwitz, where the evidence was. And as a result of wanting to ask that question, I was taken away by the Swiss authority who said they had the obligation to protect Ahmadinejad. Yes, to protect him physically, but not to protect him from a hard question. And so I think the Council on Human Rights, that's one of the first things that has to be abolished and completely undone from the top down and the bottom up. And the United Nations cannot be a credible organization as long as it has a Council on Human Rights which specializes in promoting human wrongs.
All right, well, let's turn to another topic of discussion here in Israel during the UN Secretary General's visit. Politics weren't the only thing that were on his mind. Secretary Guterres also focused on the impact of Israeli innovation on our changing world. So let's hear what he had to say and how the Israeli Prime Minister responded.
Israel is one of the most, if not the most successful knowledge-based economy in the world. And when you mention Africa, Africa that is the main victim of climate change, Africa where drought is producing dramatic results, forcing hundreds of thousands of people to flee, destroying the living conditions of full regions. If you can share the kind of innovations that you have developed, allowing to have the most effective master capacity of water in the world, that will be an enormous contribution that Israel can provide.
I suggest that this visit mark the beginning of the UN's development of an obsession with Israel. It will be a different obsession, not the false charges that are leveled against us by such enlightened countries like Libya, Iraq, Yemen, and so on. But the obsession to change the world for the better by having a partnership between Israel and these individual countries and Israel in the UN to seize the future.
Well, joining us now in the studio is Sivan Yaari, the founder and CEO of Innovation Africa, an organization that has brought Israeli solar and agricultural technologies to African villages for the past 9 years. Sivan, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure. I'm very excited about you being here, as I said. Now, you've long made it clear that with a focus on energy and with a relatively minimal investment, many of the UN's sustainable development goals can be achieved. And Israel has many of the keys to making that happen. So let's take a look at a short video clip about Innovation Africa's work.
The reason why Africa is still in poverty is because of the lack of energy. People are still searching for water. People do not have access to vaccines and medicines. And because there is no energy, people cannot get good education. Innovation Africa was founded 9 years ago with a very simple mission: to bring Israeli solar technologies to transform schools, medical centers, and most importantly, to pump water.
Are you ready to have clean water? Yes!
Thank you for having come from Israel to take us away from the darkness.
Thank you very much for the clean water.
Innovation Africa naye balukubanga etuleetera ebintu otunyeebi.
Because today Israel is a strong country, because of everything that has been invented, I feel it's our responsibility to help.
All right, well, Sivan, so tell us, how did you get started with this incredible organization?
Well, first, thank you for having me on your show. Ron, it's always a pleasure to see you. I first went to Africa 19 years ago. I was then 20 years old. I worked for an international company that was making clothes. And that was the first time I experienced real poverty. I was born in Israel, I was poor, but the type of poverty I saw in Africa was quite different. And the more time I spent in the villages, the more I realized that the main reason why Africa is still in poverty is because of the lack of energy. Because there was no energy, people cannot get good education, good healthcare, but most importantly, because there is no energy, people cannot have access to clean water. So children were searching for water, people were...
Right, walk miles and miles and miles when they could be studying or working.
And yet there is so much water right beneath their feet in the aquifers. So with a few solar panels, I went to the US, got my master's in energy, and I started bringing Israeli simple solar technologies and started in one village and another and another. And as you know, today we have impacted 150 villages.
Can you tell us a little bit about your interaction with the Secretary-General of the United Nations, who was just here? Because you actually met with him, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I had the pleasure to speak in front of him and Bibi this week. Our first relationship with the UN started in 2012 when we received consultative status to the Economic and Social Council, And then a year after, in 2013, we received the Innovation Award from the UN for our Israeli-developed remote monitoring system. But most recently, we were engaged by UNICEF to bring solar energy and water for refugees from the Central African Republic. So as we speak, I have my team of engineers on the ground using solar energy to pump water, drip irrigation, solar energy on different schools and medical centers, all working together with the team of UNICEF.
Your work, you're doing God's work. It's the most important work imaginable. You should be doing your work because it's the right thing to do. It's tikkun olam, it's a mitzvah. It's the right thing to do. Having said that, I do think that if you can contribute to solving the problems of water and energy in Africa, there's no doubt that the leaders of Africa, not Bishop Tutu perhaps, who has an inherent hatred of Israel and perhaps even of the Jewish people, but reasonable leaders in Africa will understand that they've been misled about Israel and that Israel can really help. I think that what Prime Minister Netanyahu has been doing diplomatically in Africa has been very positive as well, and I think there will be a very good return. But I want to emphasize, don't do it because of the return. Do it because what you're doing is the right thing. And then a corollary of that will be, I believe, that the United Nations will ultimately recognize Israel's contribution to solving some of Africa's most serious problems.
Now, Ambassador Prosser, I understand that you think there's also a way that we can involve the Israeli government more in the work that NGOs like Innovation Africa are doing, correct?
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, it's basically bringing Sivan and all the amazing people here that are doing, individually stuff in Africa under a banner that would not stop them, but basically help them, okay, to do what they have to do in the region. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing exactly that. He's going to go out in October to Togo, where most of the countries are. You going to be with him, Sivan?
I will be.
Yes. So instead, this is also bringing Africa and putting that, like Sivan said, on the agenda item.
Right.
Because Africa, look, there's this, until today, our best ambassadors at the United Nations, everywhere in the world, are the people that we touched. It can be Josephine from Kenya, who studied medicine. It can be Courtney, the ambassador of Jamaica, whose father worked in the Volcanic Institute. It can be heads of states and ministers who came to Israeli courses.
Mm-hmm.
This is amazing stuff.
And Sivan, I'm sure that you could use that help, right?
Of course. We from the Israeli government need people like Sivan to really guide us in what is the most efficient way.
Sivan, well, I understand that you also have a birthday surprise that you have for the professor.
Well, Alan, with your permission, we would like to bring Israeli solar technology to one village in Africa in your honor.
Oh, thank you so much. That would be such an honor for me. He who saves a single human life, it is as if they saved the world. So helping even one village would be such an honor for me.
We're going to end with a musical blessing from one of the world's greatest singers and Broadway stars, Dudu Fisher.
Hi, Alan. How are you? Happy birthday to you. Next year, we're going to have a big birthday. So we're going to be there together with you.
If you can get there.
If we can get there, that's right. And now we're going to sing for you the Hebrew version of Happy Birthday.
Thank you so much. You're one of my favorite singers in the world. As you know, every time you perform in Florida and New York, I'm always in the audience singing along with you. You are one of the great entertainers, and you bring Israeli joy to the hearts of so many people. So thank you so much.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today, unfortunately. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Dershowitz. I also want to thank our wonderful guests, Ambassador Ron Posel and Sivan Yaari, for joining us today. Now, if you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to ILTV.tv or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.